Hi, everybody. Save the best for last. So you guys are going to have to take some espresso shots for this conversation because it's going to get real. So welcome, everyone. We're so happy to be here. I'm happy to welcome Bianca Wylie to the stage. We had this conversation about a year ago at the First City of the Future event, and our conversation centered around data, the future of data, policy, management, governance, and we're pretty much going to pick up the conversation where we left off last year. In listening to some of the panels over the last couple of days, I've heard two words really stand out in every panel: people and data. So it's like two conversations that are happening, and we're hoping that today, this discussion that I'm going to have with Bianca right now, we'll be able to kind of connect the dots. We're going to try to connect the dots between people and data and what does that actually mean and look like from a tangible perspective in terms of tools that the public and private sector can actually leverage in this space. So for those of you who were not at the last City of the Future, I do want to give you some context for who Bianca is, if you guys don't already know, which you should check yourself if you don't. Bianca is a senior fellow at the Center for Innovation, or International Innovation and Governance, right? And her main areas of interest are procurement, data, and technology. She comes from a product background in technology, and beyond her role at the Center for Innovation and Governance, Bianca does lead work in the public sector for Canada at the DGen Network and is the co-founder for Tech Reset Canada. Her work focuses on examining Canadian data and technology policy decisions and their alignment with democratically informed policy and consumer protection. She has been called the Jane Jacobs of the Smart Cities movement, and her work has appeared in publications like Vice and the Huffington Post, Globe and Mail, among many, many others. So welcome, Bianca. You are so awesome. We just want to maybe tell us a little bit about where you've been in the last year since we last had our conversation.
Yeah, certainly. It's so great to be back and to get to pick up on our conversation. Thanks for the warm welcome. I have been in a few different countries and talking about data, talking about cities, talking about what to do with sort of where we are in society and technology and democracy, and in some countries, not democracy. And I think the most important thing to bring home is that nobody really knows what exactly to do right now. And so my first thought, and I think it's important for everybody in this room to know, even as professionals and as experts in your area, and I might have said this last year, if someone comes to you and is very confident in asserting that they know exactly what to do about data and the data economy, you should be a little bit concerned, because I think the consensus in the policy communities is that we have a lot of unknowns. We have a lot of issues we need to deal with that have to do with security, safety, markets, economic development, innovation. There's a lot of tension in some of these discussions. But I do think one thing I'd like to do in our time today is really be here as a resident who lives in a city and is thinking about these things. How many people are here in their capacity as residents of San Antonio? How many people are listening to this conversation as a resident? Decent number of hands? Good. Okay, because that's some of the stuff I'd like to talk about are the things that I've been raising in my city. I live in Toronto, around how cities are using data, thinking about using data, and where I think we need to be focused in 2020.
Awesome. So last time we talked, we were kind of on the verge of sort of a buzzword culture that we were creating together on stage in real time about words like, the digital social contract, or, thinking about how do we really capture the relationship that governments or the private sector have and the responsibilities they have towards residents and the community when it comes to data collection, access, and governance. Tell us some of your thoughts around what you think the tenets of this kind of contract should be, and maybe touching a little bit on when we talk about data and all of these new technologies that create a myriad of ways to collect new streams of data. How do we determine what's valuable as a community, what's worth collecting, what should we opt out of?
Yeah, sure.
You know.
Yeah, got some ideas. But I think to start around sort of the idea of a social contract or the rights and responsibilities of governments, residents, business, multiple stakeholders, it's great what Mike was talking about in terms of, we're not starting just now with technologies. We do have a long arc of the use of data and technologies. But I do think it's really critical to keep reminding ourselves of the fact that we've had about 20 years of the internet where enthusiasm for the internet and for the innovation economy really left it an unregulated space. So where we are today is we're starting to turn the corner and realize, wow, we've been doing a whole bunch of stuff that we didn't really think through because of that enthusiasm, which was not necessarily malicious, but now we're getting into cases where we're realizing, hold on, there are some problems here. There may be some issues with some of our basic fundamental freedoms, how our democracies operate, how we are safe in spaces, who is safe in spaces. I'd like to share one thing. How many people here know about Ralph Nader? I think we talked about this just briefly last year, because I want to come back to this. Right, yes, seatbelts. One thing that I've thought a lot about in the last year is consumer protection and standards, which is an interesting place in smart cities to think about. If you think about, we don't really need to use seatbelt, we can go to a toaster. Like we all have toasters, or many of us probably have toasters. And if the toaster works, it's safe. And if the toaster goes on fire, everybody gets hurt the same way by the fire. And so when you have the idea of safety, it's quite binary. It's like either it's safe or it's not. And if it hurts you, it's going to hurt you all the same. Data and the negative ways that data can be used do not affect everybody the same way. And so I think it's one of those interesting areas where we have safety regimes, but they don't graft into the digital well. Because what might be, you may say, I don't mind being tracked, because I can afford any, dealing with any of the inconveniences that might arise from that. I'm not worried about not getting, insurance for something. I'm not worried about maybe not having access to an apartment because, my activities were known to someone who was looking at me to profile me. So I think a term that one of my colleagues, Chris Gilliard, has I think it's a great term to think about is like luxury surveillance. The surveillance that we all choose to do because there's maybe some benefit to us, which might be having tracking in your car, it might be having a health monitor. There's different kinds of surveillance, I think, is one of these things that you kind of think about. So when I think about safety, it's the same thing. What might be good for some people is really not good for other people. And that puts us in a challenging paradigm, when you think about consumer protection. Another thing around sort of value of data, I think, I'd like to suggest everybody find an article that was just written by a legal scholar. His name's Frank Pasquale. And it's about first and second wave algorithmic accountability. And so it's a great piece, but I think I'll explain very quickly what it talks about. In the last maybe 5-10 years, conversations about data, which was the first wave, were saying, we have all this data. What should we do to make sure that we use it safely, we're accountable for it, we're transparent for it? That was the first wave of these conversations in smart cities as well. The second wave, which I think you're seeing with facial recognition technologies, is we're not doing this at all. That's a position. There's a position emerging in the second wave, which is abolitionist. I don't want to think about who does it impact, who doesn't it, how do we make it safe, how do we not. It's like straight up, we don't do this. This is not a thing we want to do. And I think one of the cases we've had in society before, you can't sell your organs. You can't. Even though there may be a market, there was a decision in our society here that we're not going to do that. And so you may hear people talking about, should you sell your data? Maybe, but it's a conversation that maybe that's not a thing that we want to do as a society. So I think what's happening with this second wave is we are not just thinking about how to mitigate products or services. we're actually thinking about, should they exist at all? And so I think really considering what's in a city, what infrastructures have we invested in, and what decisions have we made that the public wasn't part of, we may need to revisit some of those decisions. And so I think it's a really nice analysis in that piece. Great way to think about it. And I think that's the next sort of shift in the Overton window. You know, like maybe 5-10 years ago, it was like, no, smart cities are like, they're good, they're great, it's fine, of course we're gonna do this. And now I think there's a growing sort of demand to say, wait, are we doing this because of economic development? Are we doing this because it's really making the city, more efficient, smarter, safer? Like, what is this accomplishing? I think the bar is going up to rationalize and defend some of the choices that we've made in the past, which I think is great.
Yeah, so it's kind of like, what is the narrative, right, that we're leveraging in order to justify various forms of data collection for maybe some really excellent outcomes, like informing climate action plans, et cetera. A priority of our office is we try to lead with a community vision, right, for smart cities. So we really try to interact and engage with residents so that we can learn from them and have that drive the types of data sets, that are of value, not just to our city departments, but also to our residents and impact their daily lives. Underneath that is also kind of an education component too. Because if I go out, into the city and I talk to a random person on the street, they may have no idea what I am talking about when I am saying air quality sensor on a smart streetlight. So, what have you seen maybe other cities do to really try to uphold or uplift their residents in maybe environments where the majority of citizens are struggling with some basic social inequities, like not being able to get to work, or not having a living wage? How do we make the smart cities conversation so urgent around data relevant to them?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think this has been a challenge for me as someone who believes in democratic participation. I also think this is a critical moment for institutions and business to just act right without that pressure from the public, because I think we know right now we don't really have the time in a lot of cases to bring the public into a lot of these conversations. So I find, like, what I really, really empathize with governments right now is you've got the public staring at them saying, do something. And at the same time, I know a lot of them aren't really sure what they should do. So how do we create space and hold space for governments and companies and everyone else to figure this out a bit more with people? It's really challenging, because I'm very concerned about knee-jerk legislation and knee-jerk, like, okay, well, we have to do something, let's do this, and not thinking it through, with each other enough. Because I think that education piece is critical, but at the same time, how do you prioritize this when you have someone who is, tired at the end of the day, and then you're going to come out to a public meeting and learn about data governance? I mean, some people, okay.
Yeah.
But how is that even the right conversation? And should the conversation be, what are we doing about our climate policies? What are we doing about our transportation policies? Like, maybe we shouldn't be talking about data explicitly. Maybe we should just be thinking about the outcomes we're looking for and trust the institutions to be using data in a responsible way. Because I do see cities doing that. And I think this has been really frustrating for cities, is cities do pay a lot of attention to existing regulatory regimes, and they're not perfect, but they know they are going to be held accountable to them. Whereas the private sector is out sort of freewheeling in some of these ways that is like, I think Amazon Ring is a perfect example. There is no regulatory regime for Amazon Ring, the doorbell, none, because it breaks the separation between the state and the private sector. Because you have a consumer product that the police are coming around and asking people to take part in a program. And it's like, what is this? That's closure. You're not supposed to have that. So that's a problem. Like, these are some of the areas right now where we're having problems, where entire paradigms are like falling apart and sort of merging into each other. So not easy, but I mean, I think some of those ideas aren't, the place I would start would be to be sort of entrenching consumer products into the police state. Like, this is not, I don't know, there's a lot of cities doing that in the US right now.
So it's actually interesting, when we're talking about education, the way that I'm thinking of it is, a public entity going out and doing a campaign, educating the public on, an issue like data privacy, for example. But in the example you just gave about Amazon Ring, a typical resident is actually quite saturated with products that they've probably already consented to in various forms to collect data from them, their vehicle, right? The Amazon Ring doorbell, which is not a very expensive doorbell. So I wonder if there are some opportunities there that actually are for the private sector to take advantage of, to educate residents at that point of product purchase. Right? Do you see some opportunities there potentially?
I do, and I think this is where the private sector has historically, in some cases, led by saying, okay, we know this is not how things should be, so let's go build different products. Let's go have the fact that something's privacy enhancing as a feature. Let's have, it's like the DuckDuckGo of the search engine world. We just don't collect your data. We don't collect your searches. Use us. So you present alternatives, which I think is great. But another reason that it's of, I think, corporate interest to think very carefully about data governance policies is because the governments are not giving them the guardrails they need. I was told a story about Formula One, which I think is such a perfect story. When Formula One racing started, there was no limits on how the cars and the racing were done. And then people started dying. And so they said, okay, let's set some rules here. And what it forced was for industry to innovate within those guidelines. And they did. And it's been fine. And, that sector is thriving in as much as, Formula One is its own niche sector. But the point is that guidelines and rules do not kill innovation. They make a space for it. So for me, I'm constantly frustrated right now at the institution of government, because they're the ones who are supposed to be helping create those rules.
It's like creativity that comes from constraint, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Idea, right? So that kind of gets me to what are some of the tools, right? We're talking about toolkits a little bit. What can governments actually leverage in this space to rule make in the right way? Procurement is one of those tools, right? That scary word that we're all so familiar with. Procurement is an opportunity potentially for governments to be able to really come forward and set standards and say, hey, micromobility, so interesting. Here's the 5 types of data sets that we actually care about. How do we know that? Because we talk to our residents. This is what impacts their lives.
Yeah.
What kind of opportunities do you see potentially? Maybe this is a leading question, but do you see in procurement or any other tools that governments can leverage to rule make?
Yes, and I have a very biased position on this because I used to be a product manager in a software company. But both for corporate purchasing and for government purchasing, you can define how the thing you're buying has to work. That's called requirement writing. You say, this is you have to do these 6 things. The products or the services that I'm gonna buy must do these things. And if they don't do these things, I don't want them. And you can do that within existing procurement, but you have to have the confidence to exert that out into the market and to say, I don't just want what you're coming to me with. I'm gonna tell you what we're spending money on. And I think for the governmental procurement, massive, massive market. There's a lot of opportunity for governments to shape the products and services that have to exist in smart city or other technology spaces. But you have to go and say it. And so you have to sort of have the capacity in-house to define what you want out of technology. And I think this is sort of that gap in some of the organizations that I've worked in. Or, some people say everybody needs to learn how to code. And I'm always thinking, no, not everybody needs to learn how to code. But it certainly gives you the confidence to push back on somebody saying, we can't do this, or no, that's that. It's like, no, you can do a lot of different things. It's really freeing. There's a lot you can do with technology, but you should be setting out how it works. You shouldn't be having those things sort of forced on you or sort of presented to you as like, well, here's the thing. And cities are dangerous for this because there's a lot of market making happening in cities. But it's the cities that should be saying, this is what we should do to serve our residents, and this is how our technologies will need to work. So we should be driving that agenda more from the institutional side.
How do we deal with the boundaries of that type of legislation? We talk about like municipal ordinances or policies. You know, technology is somewhat fluid. So, you know, maybe a policy that San Antonio has, like an anti-surveillance policy, for example, it may not transcend, you know, the distance to I-35, right, to get to Austin.
Right.
So how do governments kind of innovate or think about ways that the tools that they have can actually impact maybe beyond the administrative boundaries that they're responsible for?
Yeah, I think no one wants to talk about human resources and organizational design in cities enough. People like to say, oh, we don't have a culture of innovation, or we just need a culture of innovation and then we'll be fine. And it's like, no, you need people to be incentivized to step outside of what the current regime says to do. Because if you're only going to get in trouble, why would you step outside of your lines? It doesn't make sense. But that's a human resources issue. And I think in order for cities to work better and differently, there needs to be more departmental and divisional collaboration in some cases. You need to get the CTOs or the CIOs a little bit, off the high horse and kind of say, other, parks, come tell us what you need in your language and we'll serve you. There needs to be a bit of reorganization there, and that requires leadership within the organization in human resources and organizational design. That's not a technical problem. And so it really frustrates me when I see management consultants come into cities and tell the cities and the governments, now we're in decade 4 of we just need a culture shift in here. It's no, it's not that. And it's being called modernization, it's being called, I've heard this song for decades already. If you don't get into human incentives to do the things that need to get done, why would anyone do it? It doesn't make sense. So I think we need to get honest about those kinds of changes in organizations, not just government. I mean, any corporate organization, it's the same. I work with people who work in banks. In an ideal case, they would be sharing across services, right? All the way from, birth, child, university, home, all the way to death. But each division is sort of like, this is my client information, I'm not giving it to you. So there's no mandate across the organization to support that kind of an experience. That's organizational design. So you can't expect people to just do that. It has to be part of a directive, and I think that comes back to leadership.
Do you think that there's a connection between how we capture, collect data, and organizational management, kind of in the way that you just described?
A connection between them? Totally. I think we are living through this sort of myth-busting moment where people were worried about, if someone sees my data, I'm going to get in trouble, or if the data is open, there's going to be some big scandal, because I know there was years of that. So I do think there's a little more comfort in the idea, but I also think that a lot of people who are professionals in all of their different realms aren't super concerned about more data half the time. They're more like, we know what our problems are, they're over here, we've had them for a long time. Let's not get distracted by data. I think data is taking on a bit of an oversized role sometimes in what it can accomplish. I think a lot of the value of data is, I probably said this last year, I feel like we're in the 90s where there's a lot of frothiness around a lot of the data, yeah, is it valuable? Or is it becoming a liability? Not sure. We don't ask those questions often enough in terms of what is the marginal value of this? Why are we paying for it? What would happen if there was a breach? Is this the way we should assess it? Are we looking at what it means if someone comes and knocks on your door? And I think this is a very political question. It's you might work in transportation and you might think it's fine to have all the data that you have. But if federal government comes and says, hey, give me that data, they want it for a different reason than the reason you have it. There's no protection there for a resident. So I think what happens now is that each division and department has to be thinking beyond their use and into that wicked problem of well, what if someone else has this? Which is a totally different analysis that I don't think anyone's really in charge of at any level of government. And this is sort of what I'm talking about with this is hard. This is not something where everybody knows what to do about those cases.
Yeah, it's super messy, and it sounds like what you're saying is that maybe instead of putting those policies around data collection and saying here's how we rule make around data collection, it sounds like what you're saying is we need to shift to a model where we're saying here's how we rule make around use.
Yeah.
And I wonder while it is kind of easy to maybe anticipate how we can collect data based on technologies that are currently on the market, how do we anticipate use and regulate around it?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think use is a much more important place to look in terms of how to regulate, because just trying to say who should own something or who should collect it, the capacity to control that right now is not high. And I think in terms of anticipating use, it's funny. I've talked to people who've always said things like, yeah, have fun. Like if someone wants to do something bad, they're going to do it. They're going to do it. So you have to think about consequence of use and accountability for misuse. And how do you build regimes around that? Because right now, most of what we have is privacy related. That does not help you when you're being discriminated against in many instances. And one of the examples I like to use is around an app that it's been taken down since, but you were able to basically, like if I was looking for childcare, I could say, here are the names of some people, pay to have them profiled, have the firm come back and say, oh, this person you were looking at for childcare, they're up a lot at this time of the night, or they listen to this music, or they seem to swear a lot. And I could get a report like that from their social media. And the problem with that is that if that happened to you, you would never know that happened. So that's not like going to a job interview where something happened and you can go say there was a human rights discriminatory action at that job interview, because you don't know that you were profiled. And so this is a major problem right now when I talk about certain things are just in total free fall. If you are being profiled, and people are being profiled right now all the time, and you don't know what's happening, how are you supposed to manage that case, right? Like, what is the regulatory regime for that? Challenging, right? So
I'm stressing out.
Yeah, well, and the answer to this stuff is, and this is why we really need to think more broadly than data and technology, is back to basics. If there's adequate housing supply for everybody that lives in a country, being discriminated against by a potential landlord, it doesn't make it perfect for that to happen, but the stakes certainly go down when there's lots of other places you can live. So like trying to solve some of these problems at the edge instead of at the base is a mistake, because you're not going to solve a lot of this stuff at the tech level. You're going to solve it out in society and investing in public infrastructures and housing and like all of the things that we need for a healthy society. You can't solve those things with technology.
It's a really interesting point, because what you're saying is instead of spending the time and energy to write a legislative policy that captures all the potential uses, maybe there are ways to engineer society in such a way that those uses aren't even necessary or required, right? So maybe in a world where we do focus on housing, or we do focus on trying to resolve some of those social inequities, the use cases may not even appear for certain kinds of data sets.
That's right, and this is a really good
idea.
It's a really good global example. I was at a conference in Scandinavia, and they were talking about making like an open wallet for people's education history, so that your information about your high school performance and all the rest of it would be totally public. And I'm sitting there going, okay, this feels like a potential problem for people applying to university if maybe that was an information that they would want shared, all of it, or maybe there was pressure to do it. And the reason that idea sounds great in Scandinavia is because everybody gets to go to university. So you can't take these policies out of their national context and reapply them, because they're different. There's a different social contract in some of these different spaces. So this is why this global conversation can get a little bit unwieldy, is you can sit in one room and be like, yeah, that would be fine here, that would be really problematic there. So the internet's everywhere, but all the constructs don't travel.
So I have a lot more questions for you. We've hit time. Tell me something good.
Tell you something good. Like encouraging? Encouraging?
However you want to interpret that question.
Tell you something good. Okay. Let me see if I had anything good in here.
She's got to look in her book.
Did I have something good in here?
what should we be optimistic for, right? There's so many things we should be afraid of, so much messiness, so much hard stuff, so many things that makes us tired, being both in the private and public sector in this emerging, innovative, transforming space.
Yes.
What's good?
Okay,
right?
so I'll tell you what's good. Hand washing is good. I'll tell you why I give you that answer. And because this is exactly what I'm struggling with right now, so I'd love everybody's help on this as we all exist in this world together. How do we make old, and I'm thinking about it as like non-novel, like old information, things we've known for a long time that work, how do we make them as valued and as prominent and as exciting as new things? Because like I'm from Canada, there is a lot of stuff going on in, we're having a reconciliation conversation with Indigenous peoples. In terms of climate, there is some very, very, very old knowledge around taking care of our environment that we don't seem to value. And I say hand washing because something like 19,000 people die in,
I said good, Bianca.
I'm getting there. It's hand washing. It's hand washing. They die from hospitals because they pick stuff up and they just haven't washed their hands. But if you wash your hands, and I think you notice right now, people are washing their hands like surgeons because of what's happening in the world. I don't know if you're noticing this, but it works. And we have things that we know that work, and they're not complicated and they're not complex. So I think what I'm really encouraged about in cities and in other places is bringing the things that we already know to the front of the line and leaning into that knowledge that's tested, true, known, and not novel. But we know this works. Let's do this thing. It's not a mystery. It's not complex. We're not introducing complexity. We're not making markets out of it. It's just what do we do for justice, for truth, for spaces that we know that we just need to fund certain things to make things available to people. Let's just do that. That's good. That's available to us. I think we're sort of in a good moment to push on that, and for people who aren't technical to stand up and be like, guess what? I already know how I should do this. It's calling, I'll end on this note. Do people know where the term con man comes from? What's so weird? I'm having deja vu. If I told you this again, I'm gonna laugh. It's a confidence trick. It's a con is for confidence. And cons and scams and grifts, a lot of it has to do with this is good, trust me. And so what I feel great about right now is no, I know what I know. I know this, I have knowledge that's non-new. I know it matters, and lots of other professionals know that as well. So dig into what you know and what you've always known and assert that, and I think that will really provide some good tension into these spaces. And that's we know it's gonna work, so let's do more of what we know works. I think that's a good note to end on, is that that's an option and we can all do that. So let's do more of that and less of the sort of unknown complexity that we're creating for very little tested value in some cases. Let's go with what we know and go old school.
Go with what you know.
Go with what you know. Go classic knowledge.
Thank you. Beautiful. Thank you so much, Bianca.
Thanks for having
everybody,
me.
Just join me around in applause. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.